Okay.
Yep.
And action.
So the Utopia Trial was my graduation film from the animation course at Leeds Arts University. This was the biggest project I'd ever undertaken up to this point. So the film was developed around the idea to showcase a lot of the skills that I've developed throughout uni. So things like the organisational skills, the amount of visual effects, and the amount of collaborators. So a good exciting challenge, for example, is the fact that I'm incorporating fully CG characters into this film and having them interact with live action footage. So while this was an incredibly ambitious project for me, I did go through the script making sure that it was something that was achievable. So 2 characters, 1 location, 4 days of shooting. A lot of other members of my course were involved in pre-production. So we started with Back doing the concept art for both the drone and the city. We went through a fair amount of iterations on the design of the drone to try and make sure it looked aggressive but also fit the same universe as the city. I knew sort of inspirations of what I wanted it to look like, so we kept a lot of angular designs, a kind of hexagonal shape to everything. So the costumes were designed and made by Joanna. As the story was combining sci-fi elements and Western elements, we wanted to make sure that the costumes matched that. So the costumes have a very Clint Eastwood vibe. There's a lot of A Man with No Name in there. In order to keep the budget down, we sourced a lot of the costume pieces from charity shops, and then Joanna aged and distressed them and modified them. We also wanted to show the fact that this being a post-apocalyptic world with the wear and tear on their costumes. And this also shows their experience in the world. For example, the Wanderer's costume is a bit more degraded and a bit more worn and aged compared to the Stranger's costume, who is a bit more naive and a bit more new to this world. So the storyboards for the film were done by Alex Thomas, who was another classmate of mine. I created a shot list as part of the script which Alex worked from to create the storyboards. It was much easier to visualise which shots were visual effects shots by using the storyboard, and it also meant that we could save time on set because I didn't have to remember which shot was what, I could just look at it. From the storyboards I was able to create an animatic which helped me gauge how long the film would be. This didn't end up being completely accurate, as the animatic was 6 minutes but the film ended up being 10. The animatic at least gave me a clear vision of where I wanted things to cut and how long certain parts were going to last, which gave me a better understanding of how I was going to approach filming it. For the most part, the storyboards were actually pretty spot on to what we ended up filming. There was only a handful of occasions where I switched a direction or went a bit wider or closer in. So the Wanderer is played by another classmate of mine, Liam Shevell, who I'd previously worked with on my dissertation short film, and the Stranger was played by Ellen Carnazza. Of the 4-day shoot, Ellen was only there for the 2nd and 4th day, so we had to work around the script out of sequence, which was good practice as I've never really shot anything out of sequence before. One of the best things I'd think about the shoot was the fact that I had 3 other people working as crew. This was something that meant that I could delegate other tasks that I would otherwise have to run around doing myself. This meant I could stay way more focused on the actual overarching story and make sure that I was paying attention to the right things. Joanna was worrying about continuity and costume and helping me manage the script, while Andrew and Liam were working on camera and audio. It ended up going a lot smoother than I expected, and this is mostly down to the amount of planning that we did in pre-production. The storyboards and the shot list helped an awful lot in keeping us on track and making sure we knew which shots we needed to get done by what time in order to stay on schedule. So I shot this whole film on this camera that I'm filming with right now, which is the Canon M50. This is a really fantastic camera for the price, and I only really used 2 lenses on this film. I used the kit lens that the camera came with, and then a 50mm f1.8. I also tried to emulate the classic Hollywood look with some anamorphic filters that I placed in the back of the lens. These were just 3D printed little filters, very, very easy, very cheap, but it does create a big difference from a cinematography point of view.
Utopia.
Overall, I was just incredibly happy with how smooth the entire shoot went. Both of the actors were fantastic to work with. We managed to get everything done on schedule and to a quality that I was very happy with.
Damn, that was a strong one.
Fantastic.
So editing something of this scale was again something very new to me. There was about 220 gigabytes of footage that we'd shot over the 4-day period. As I started to go through the edit, I realised it was ending up way longer than I expected. Mainly just because there was a lot of time taken up with just the general breathing room of some shots that I hadn't anticipated when I did the animatic. This wasn't necessarily an issue because the amount of visual effects shots was still the same. It's just that some of those shots were a bit longer than I expected. For the most part though, the edit was pretty much the same as the animatic in terms of the order of shots. There was only about 3 or 4 shots that I ended up actually cutting. Once the drones were designed by Back, another of my classmates, Dan, did the modelling, rigging and texturing for these drones and made them look as photoreal as possible. I was incredibly happy with the result that we've got from the drones. I think that Back's initial design and Dan's creation of it in Maya worked really, really well together to create a final version of this villain that works really well for the whole film. So once Dan had finished creating the drones, it was then up to me to animate them. There ended up being about 40 shots that needed the drones in. Purely by the nature of these drones, they weren't really that complex to animate. A couple of the most challenging shots were the explosions of the drones. The first drone's explosion, I attempted to do an automated simulation, but unfortunately I couldn't really get it to work with the model that we had. So I ended up manually animating all of the pieces flying apart, which took a long time, but I'm very happy with the result. Both of the other destructions were also manually animated, but I was especially happy with the second drone that deactivates inside the farmhouse. The animation of that one I think has a good amount of weight, and I was very happy with how that one came out. For the lighting and rendering of the drones, I used a few HDRI images that I shot on set. This gives the renderer the exact reflections and lighting so that it can create the most accurate version of that scene possible. This helped massively when compositing because it meant that the lighting was already pretty much correct. All I had to do was sort of match the exposure. I was most excited for the compositing part of the process, as that's often one of the most satisfying parts, as you see things come together and try to make them look photoreal. And a lot of that is giving it imperfections of a camera. So obviously motion blur is very important, but also things like noise and chromatic aberration to make it look like it was actually captured by a camera. One of the biggest parts of the visual effects in this film was the lasers. Not because they were difficult, but just because there were so many of them. I used the inbuilt particle generator in After Effects to create the lasers. I was very keen on the idea of having a bit of a trail left behind by the lasers that could kind of float through the air. Once the city was designed, we tried compositing the matte painting version of it, but we were struggling to get it to look photoreal. So I instead actually decided to 3D model the city, because then I'd have more control over the lighting and the angle and like the lens type and everything like that. So we used the green screen for a few shots that had the city behind the actors, but there were some shots where it just wasn't really possible to put the green screen into. So for those ones, I ended up using a Lumimat just from the contrast of a human figure against a white background. Using the exposure of the sky, I could create a Lumimat that would allow me to put the city behind the actors. But there was then a few shots which I just had to completely manually rotoscope. One shot in particular that was manually rotoscoped was the second running shot with the city on his side. I did actually manage to use the grass as a green screen for that shot, but everything above that line I had to manually rotoscope frame by frame. That one took an awful long time to rotoscope because there's so much movement and it's quite a long shot and it's in slow motion. We did attempt to use the green screen on that shot, which certainly looked funny, but it just wasn't working, so I had to rotoscope it. Which is why it was very important that I got lots of takes from every visual effects shot. The heads-up display that both characters have in their eye implants were very fun to animate because that was something very different. That was a little bit more motion graphic animation, which I haven't really done much of, but I was actually very happy with the results of that. So sound design isn't really one of my strengths, but it was something that I wanted to try and push myself in. I found doing a lot of the Foley sounds was actually very satisfying. The footsteps and the breathing and stuff like that. That was all very important to make the world actually feel alive and not just empty noise. Most of the laser sounds were actually just me going like pew, 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 and distorting it a bit. I think it works because I also layered in some distorted real gun shots to give it the initial force, but then have that sci-fi element after the fact. For the music in the film, I worked with a student from Leeds College of Music called Simon. It was fairly late into the project that I brought him in, and he did a fantastic job of creating the music that he did in such a short space of time. We tried to make sure that we were keeping it pretty sci-fi, but also having some hints to a bit of a Western genre. Simon really understands telling the story through the music, and I think the music does a really fantastic job of completing the film. I really tried to help tell the story in the colour grade, so I desaturated the greens to make this world look really quite dead and barren and a bit depressing, whereas the blues of the city were boosted to try and make it a bit more optimistic and a bit more hopeful. I also boosted the reds a fair amount to try and make sure that the red eye of the drones really stood out. I really wanted that to be quite contrasted and quite menacing. This was one of the more creative colour grades that I've ever done. Anytime I've usually colour graded footage has been to make it look sort of normal, whereas this colour grade is a bit more creative in the sense that it's not like real life. This film was intended to challenge me in lots of different ways to culminate skills that I'd gathered throughout uni and before, and I think overall it's really taught me an awful lot about the production process and directing and producing and the visual effects pipeline. This was the first time I'd really collaborated to such a degree on a film, and I think it's all the better for it. I got to work with other people who could focus on their specialties so that I could focus on mine. I think this film really opened a door for me that let me understand what I really enjoy doing most. At the time of filming this, it's a year since I finished the Utopia Trial, and since then I've worked on a new short film called Warlock, which I've managed to apply so many things that I learned doing Utopia Trial, and I'm really excited to work on more projects like this. I really hope that you enjoyed the film, and if you did, please consider sharing it with other people who you think might enjoy it and getting it seen by as many people as possible. I also hope you enjoyed watching this little breakdown of how the film was made, and yeah, thank you for watching.
Three, two.
Leave it!
Get out of here, maybe I'll see you in another day.
So would I. You didn't have to come. Fuck! Sorry!
Okay, cut! Oh, you should just let me see.
All the way down to Silston.
Let's walk home.
That is a wrap!
Good job he was filming that.